Number 12. Montauk Monster. Wet sand grips your shoes at ditch plains. Wind comes off the Atlantic carrying salt, rot, and that metallic edge you notice when something has died nearby. Ahead, strangers have formed a tight half-circle at the surf line, staring down. In the middle lies a body the sea has edited. Hair gone, skin swollen gray, front paws curled into clawed hands, the snout stripped so clean it almost looks like a beak. No one agrees on what they are seeing. A dog, a turtle without a shell, a lab escaped from Plum Island. Jenna Hewitt raises a camera, and in that instant, a dead animal becomes a modern sea monster. Then the body disappears, the photo spreads, and the ocean leaves everyone arguing over fragments. Something comes up from the water, but never whole. On July 12, 2008, Jenna Hewitt is 26 years old. She is not out here looking for a mystery. She is on the eastern end of Long Island with friends, on a summer beach where the day should be simple. Bright water, wind over the dunes, people moving in towels and flip-flops between the parking lot and the surf. Then something in the crowd stalls. Heads turn in one direction. People who are walking keep going until they see it, and then they stop too. Jenna moves closer. The smell hits first. Not dead fish. Bigger than that. Older. The kind of smell that seems to have weight. There in the sand, where the foam reaches and retreats, lies a dead animal no one can place at a glance. It is hairless, or nearly so. The body is bloated. The skin is tight and grayish, glossy with salt water. The forelimbs pull the eye first. Small, disturbingly hand-like, ending in long, curved claws darkened by wet sand. The head is worse. Soft tissue around the snout has come away, and the face narrows to a hard-looking point. From a few feet back, it does not read as bone, it reads as a beak. People start trying names on it, as if one of them might make it less strange. Dog, big rat, possum. No, look at the feet. No, look at the mouth. Someone says turtle, and even they do not sound convinced. Someone else says Plum Island, and the air around the carcass changes immediately. Plum Island sits off Long Island's eastern tip, a government animal disease center founded in 1954. It is exactly the kind of nearby place that makes a bad photograph dangerous. A dead thing with the wrong silhouette is enough. Jenna is, by her own later description, shocked and amazed. So are the others. She lifts her camera. The click takes less than a second. The body stays where it is, one more piece of washed-up debris on a beach that will erase its tracks by evening. But the image now exists, and the image is cleaner than the reality. It crops away the smell, it flattens the surf, it strips out motion, sound, and scale. Without anything solid beside the carcass, no ruler, no shoe, no hand, the animal could be huge or small. It could be a juvenile. It could be something familiar made unrecognizable by water. Or it could be exactly what people want it to be. Jenna and her friends stand there with the others, looking down. The Atlantic keeps arriving in short white lines behind them. A gull lands, thinks better of it, and hops back. The thing in the sand is maybe 65 centimeters long by later estimate, roughly 25.6 inches, but no one on the beach has that number yet. What they have is shape. As decay gets its turn, shape lies. Some details still stick. The front paws look too dexterous. The jawline looks wrong. The head seems too narrow for a dog, too mammalian for a turtle, too theatrical for an ordinary raccoon. If you crouch and stare at it long enough, your brain slips between categories. One animal after another, each one rejected. The body is not impossible, it is incomplete. Jenna takes the picture anyway, maybe more than one. Around her, people keep talking over each other. A beach mystery lasts only as long as the tide allows, and everyone seems to feel that. Somebody lets out the nervous laugh people use when they are grossed out, but thrilled to have been there. Somebody else leans in, then backs away fast when the smell rolls up again. The ocean keeps touching the carcass and pulling back, touching it and pulling back, as if deciding whether to take it. For 11 days, it remains a local oddity. Then, on July 23rd, East Hampton's paper, The Independent, runs the image under a playful headline, "The Hound of Bonnickville." That could have been the end of it. A beach photo, a weird dead animal, a summer curiosity with a pun attached. Then, on July 29th, Gawker posts the photo as a dead monster, and the beach scene detonates. Now the carcass is no longer lying in front of a few shocked witnesses at Ditch Plains. It is lying in front of everyone, on screens, in forums, in headlines. The picture gives almost nothing trustworthy about scale, so the guesses multiply faster than the facts. Turtle without a shell, pit bull, giant rodent, hoax, mutant, escapee, experiment, Plum Island again. Always Plum Island. Beach itself begins to vanish from the story, not literally. It vanishes the way the internet strips things down. First the place goes, then the wind, then the smell, then the uncertainty in the voices of the people who are actually there. What remains is the frozen body and the human need to force it into a category dramatic enough to share. Stay in the original scene though, at the surf line with Jenna Hewitt and the knot of people around her, and the details point somewhere much less cinematic and much more convincing. A raccoon has the right skull proportions. A raccoon has the right kind of teeth. A raccoon has front paws so oddly deft they can look almost human when the fur is gone and the tendons tighten in death. And that beak-like face is likely no beak at all. Seawater removes the nose and soft facial tissue, leaving exposed premaxillary bone where a snout used to be. The monster shape is real. It is real in the most ordinary way possible: decomposition. Naturalists and science writers would later say exactly that. East Hampton Natural Resources Director Larry Penny pointed to a raccoon, perhaps skinned, perhaps with the upper jaw damaged or missing. Darren Naish and others went further into the anatomy and showed how the photo fits Procyon loder, the common North American raccoon, far better than any exotic candidate. The claws fit, the skull shape fits, the body length fits. What never fits is the ending. By the time those explanations arrive, the thing Jenna photographed is gone. Moved, lost, discarded, taken by someone, taken by the tide. The chain breaks almost at once. There is no preserved specimen, no verified collection, no lab table, clean set of measurements, just one famous image and the memory of a body on wet sand. The Montauk Monster was most likely a raccoon. The carcass disappeared. Number 11. Canvey Island Monster. On August 13, 1954, a short local newspaper item turned a dead animal on Canvey Beach into one of Britain's strangest shoreline legends. The report was brief. The photograph was black and white. The language was plain enough to seem harmless, but it attached one real man's name to the find: Reverend Joseph D. Overs. That name mattered because Overs was not just a name in print. He lived on the island. Canvey was not just another seaside town. It covered about 18.5 square kilometers and lay roughly 1 meter below mean high water level. In 1953, that stopped being geography. At around 1 a.m. on Sunday, February 1st, a North Sea storm surge hit the island's defenses. The seawall failed. Water crossed the low ground in the dark. Canvey was evacuated. 58 people died. So when the sea gave something back the next year, people did not look at it calmly. Joseph Overs was a reverend. He was also known locally as a photographer. That detail puts him in a very specific place in the story. He did not only see the carcass, he recorded it. He fixed it in an image. He helped give it a second life in print. By August 1954, people already had another body in mind. A similar strange carcass had appeared nearby in November 1953, only months after the flood. There was no full scientific case file, no museum specimen, just the sort of thing people remember because they saw enough to feel uneasy, then watched it disappear. One odd body after disaster can be waved off. Two on the same island within a year begins to feel like a pattern. That is how a coastline starts to carry a legend. The article tied to Overs described the new carcass in language built for tabloids. It was over 4 feet long, around 120 centimeters. It had staring eyes, a large mouth, and underneath, 2 5-toed feet. That word changed everything. Feet is not anatomy. It is a human translation. It takes something marine, damaged, swollen, half-rotted, and pulls it into the language of land animals. You can almost see the thought process happening. There is a carcass with projections under the body. There are digits or rays or collapsed fin supports. There is a shape nobody expects on an English beach, so people call them feet. The moment that word lands, the carcass stops sounding like a fish and starts sounding like evidence. There was another line in later newspaper retellings that shifts the story again. Overs did not remain the priest who found a monster and recoiled from it. He later identified it, or tried to. The carcass was described as a pocket fish, then explained as an angler-type fish. sea devil, frogfish, toadfish, fishing frog. In other words, not a survivor from some hidden abyssal branch of evolution, but a damaged, unfamiliar fish from waters the public barely understood. That version is less glamorous. It is also the version that usually survives close inspection. Picture Overs on the beach anyway, not the legend, the man. The tide is out. The Thames estuary has left weed, drift, mud, and one body that does not belong in an ordinary morning walk. The skin looks wrong. The proportions look wrong. The eyes seem to stare, the way dead fish do. Under the body, two structures really do look disturbingly like little legs. That same Tuesday, a small note in the local paper said a seal was seen in Benfleet Creek for the first time within living memory. That was not proof of monsters. It showed something simpler and stranger. The estuary was surfacing unfamiliar life and forcing people to look at it. Across cases like this, the sea rarely hands over a clean answer. It does not deliver animals intact, labeled, and laid out for inspection. It delivers fragments. Those fragments land in communities already shaped by fear. Canvey had more reason than most to read the shore that way. After 1953, the seawall was no longer just concrete and earth. It marked the edge of memory. Behind it were houses, names, and the knowledge that water had crossed that line before. So when a carcass appeared with bulging eyes and supposed feet, people were not only seeing biology. They were hearing the sea continue something it had already said in the flood. By 1959, in Frank Edwards's book Stranger Than Science, the Canvey carcass had swollen into something much more theatrical. The details grew more dramatic. The official reactions grew stranger. The certainty grew stronger, even though the original reports had very little of it. The dead fish became a sea creature. The sea creature became a near-humanoid oddity. This is source inflation in its purest form. Each retelling strips away the modesty of the original and keeps the parts that make the next retelling harder to resist. The photograph helped that process. The photograph has its own problem. Researchers have since pointed to inconsistencies in the archived material. Famous black and white carcass image may have been printed with the 1954 Fish with Feet story, or it may have been attached later from a different clipping altogether. Font differences, missing local newspaper runs, incomplete archives. The paper trail does not hold together cleanly, so the man who should anchor the story, Joseph D. Overs, becomes strangely difficult to recover. We know his name, we know the date attached to the report, we know what the public was told he found. But when you try to pin down exactly what he photographed, exactly what was printed, and exactly which carcass became the famous monster, the record starts to slide. That is the Canvey pattern, not a neat specimen in a jar, not a zoological puzzle waiting for one bold genius. A beach, a flood-haunted island, a reverend with a camera. One carcass in 1953, another in 1954, likely some kind of anglerfish or monkfish-like body distorted by damage and retelling. Around it sits a documentary fog so thick that even the photo may not belong cleanly to the story people think they know. The Canvey Island Monster was probably never a monster in the biological sense. It was a post-disaster artifact, a dead fish, a vulnerable place, and a community ready to read warning signs in whatever the tide abandoned. The body washed in broken. The evidence stayed broken. The archive failed. The legend did not. As one newspaper put it, it was simply a fish with feet. Number 10. Sakhalin Sea Monster. In late June 2015, people walking the shore near Shakhtarsk Airport on Sakhalin Island found a carcass ripped open by surf and scavengers. They did what makes a beach mystery spread faster than any lab report. They took pictures first. The body was reported as roughly twice the size of a human being. Long, pale, partly skeletal. At one end was a narrow snout, almost beak-like. At the other was a ragged mass that online reports quickly turned into the detail nobody could resist. Fur. A furry tail, attached to something with a huge nose, dumped on a remote Russian beach. By July 1st, English-language outlets had it. By July 3rd, the carcass was already doing what these cases always do after the photos get out. It stopped being a dead animal. It became a monster assembled from the wrong parts. Early reports quoted Nikolai Kim of the Sakhalin Research Institute of Fisheries and Oceanography. Kim said the head resembled that of a large dolphin. That should have narrowed things down. Instead, the photographs pushed in the other direction. People heard dolphin, then saw what looked like fur. The image split in half. Marine mammal in front, something else in back. That is exactly where bad identifications thrive. One expert detail, one impossible detail, and no body on a table yet. Online speculation jumped almost immediately to a Ganges river dolphin. It sounds exotic enough to survive for years, but the geography kills it fast. The Ganges river dolphin is a freshwater animal from South Asia. Sakhalin sits in the Russian Far East, facing the Okhotsk Sea in the North Pacific. One lives in river systems thousands of miles away. The other carcass washed up beside a cold coastal airport on an island where North Pacific cetaceans actually occur. The viral answer was interesting. The local answer was plausible. Strip the photo down the way a forensic team would. Ignore the legend. Look at the parts. Start with the snout. Beaked whales are called beaked whales for a reason. Their heads taper into a narrow rostrum. Once skin peels back and soft tissue collapses, that shape can look even more extreme than it did in life. On a damaged carcass, especially one photographed from odd angles on wet sand, the front end stops reading as whale to non-specialists. It starts reading as bird, reptile, or something nobody has cataloged yet. But a long, beak-like snout on a North Pacific carcass is not a sign that the identification has failed. It is one of the stronger reasons it may be right. Now the size. Reports called it about twice the size of a human being. That does not fit a Ganges River dolphin well. It fits a juvenile large cetacean much better. Later reviews pointed toward a whale calf, probably a giant beaked whale. Once that possibility enters the frame, the scale stops looking strange. It looks like what you would expect from a young animal still far from adult length. Then there is the range. NOAA places Baird's beaked whales in the North Pacific and adjacent seas, including the Okhotsk Sea. Adults reach about 35 to 36 feet and can weigh up to roughly 26,455 pounds. More important than the maximum is the map. These whales belong in these waters. They have even been observed near shore in the Bering and Okhotsk Seas between May and October. Late June near Sakhalin is not random. It falls within the season and within the region where a beaked whale explanation makes biological sense. The internet imported a freshwater animal from South Asia because the photo looked weird. The sea already had the right species nearby. That leaves the fur. That detail kept the monster alive. If the carcass were simply a decomposed whale calf, people expect blubber, skin, bone, not hair, not a shaggy-looking tail section. But Sergei Kornev of the Kamchatka Research Institute of Fisheries and Oceanography said that fur may not have been fur at all. It may have been bristle-like decomposed soft tissue, the kind of stringy breakdown seawater can produce after skin and connective layers begin to separate. The most memorable feature in the picture may have been the least reliable anatomical feature on the body. Beach carcasses are not intact diagrams. Water edits them. Bacteria edit them. Birds, crabs, and sand edit them. A whale in life has a clean outline. A whale after days in surf turns into a shredded argument. Tissue slips, mouth lines distort, bones show where they should not. Ordinary structures vanish. Accidental ones appear. What looked like a pelt may have been wrought with good publicity. Kim's later position moved in that direction. Within days, after a group of scientists reviewed the photographs, the remains were judged to be a whale calf, likely a giant beaked whale. Not an undiscovered species, not a river dolphin somehow ending up in the Okhotsk Sea. A young beaked whale, made grotesque by decomposition and made famous by timing. The timing did the rest. The carcass appeared before any formal necropsy. Photographs spread before a chain of custody existed. Reporters pulled the strangest descriptors first. Furry tail, huge nose. Audiences saw the image without scale bars, without tissue samples, without a marine mammal pathologist standing beside it. The first version to seize the public imagination was the least stable one. By the time the explanation arrived, the monster already had a lead. Then the evidence broke apart for good. A storm carried the carcass back out to sea. There was no formal physical examination that settled the matter in public. No preserved specimen. No tissue archive for later DNA testing. Only the visual record, the expert reading of that record, and the fact that the body itself was gone. That is how these stories keep their edge. The likely identification becomes strong. It never becomes absolute. The deep gives you a few angles, a few measurements, one unforgettable false clue, and then takes the specimen back. So the Sakhalin Sea Monster reads best as a detective case with one loud witness and several quiet facts. The witness is the photograph. The quiet facts are range, size, skull shape, season, and decomposition. They point in one direction. A decomposed young beaked whale, probably a giant beaked whale, made uncanny by damage. But the picture got there first, and pictures are ruthless. They flatten scale, they exaggerate texture, they make rotten tissue look like anatomy. They keep turning up as broken pieces of evidence from the deep. On that beach near Shakhtarsk Airport, before the storm erased the body, someone still stood over the carcass with a camera and framed the tail. The part that looked most like fur. Number 9. Pukehina Beach Sea Monster. On April 28, 2013, a YouTube video from Pukehina Beach in New Zealand's Bay of Plenty did what these carcasses always do. It showed just enough. A long body half buried in wet sand, a huge skull shape, rows of visible teeth, small flipper-like limbs. The lower half was so torn away that the animal barely looked like an animal anymore. It looked pieced together. The person behind the camera was identified in later coverage as Elizabeth Ann. She had been riding along the beach with a group on four-wheel vehicles after violent storms hit the coast. Pukehina sits about 250 kilometers, or 155 miles, southeast of Auckland. Not far enough to stay hidden forever. Far enough for one bad angle to become the whole story. She uploaded the footage that same day, April 28th, and asked viewers a simple question. What is it? By early May, the clip had pulled in about 1.2 million views. That number matters because each view added confidence, not evidence. The body was still one carcass on one strip of sand. Online, it became 5 animals at once. Crocodile, giant eel, dolphin, dinosaur, hoax. People were not looking at a specimen. They were looking at a silhouette with teeth. Start with the numbers that survive the noise. About 9 meters long. About 30 feet. That wipes out a lot of fantasies right away. Too large for a typical stranded seal, sea lion, or shark. Large enough for a cetacean. Large enough for an orca, especially if surf damage stretched the body and the camera warped the distance by leaving one end buried and the other exposed. A 30-foot carcass sounds like a monster. It also lands very close to a real killer whale. Then there was the head. That was the trap. People are bad at reading damaged skulls in isolation because the jaw drags all attention toward itself. Teeth mean predator. Exposed teeth mean prehistoric predator. But decomposition rewrites the picture. Lips rot away. Soft tissue peels back, skin tightens or tears. The jaw does not become more dangerous, it becomes more visible. What looked like an oversized reptile face may have been a mammal face with the covering stripped off. Now the flippers. This is where the case stops being spectacle and starts being forensics. Within days, marine mammal expert Anton van Helden told New Zealand media that the key clue was not the dramatic tooth line, it was the flipper structure. Not the part that made headlines, the part that kept its geometry. In carcass identification, that matters more than the feature audiences choose first. Teeth can mislead when the tissue is gone. Limbs often do not. Take away the whale silhouette and most people lose the category. A live orca is one of the most recognizable marine animals on Earth. Black back, white patches, tall dorsal fin, clean outline. Remove the color. Hide the dorsal fin. Break the smooth taper of the body. Tear open the lower half. Leave the jaw and 1 or 2 appendages. Recognition falls apart. Familiar anatomy stops looking familiar. The timing adds another useful number. On April 22, 2013, 6 days before the video was posted, reports from nearby Pilot Bay in Taronga Harbor described about 7 orca feeding on stingrays. That does not prove the Pukehina carcass came from that group. It cannot. But it does something smaller and more solid. Places orca in the local scene. In the same Bay of Plenty waters, in the same week. The explanation is not coming from some distant field guide, it was already offshore. Line up the clues the way a pathologist would, even though no public record points to a full necropsy or DNA test. Date, April 28th upload, after storms. Place, Pukehina Beach, Bay of Plenty. Length, roughly 9 meters. Context, 7 orca reported nearby on April 22nd. Diagnostic feature, flipper structure. Distorting feature, exposed teeth. Missing feature, the normal body profile. The pattern is familiar. Storm damage strips away the readable outline. Scavengers and surf erase soft tissue. The camera fixes on the one part that looks least ordinary. The public names the animal from the wrong end. You can feel that process if you stand on the sand for a second. The carcass is half sunk in the beach. One side disappears into wet sand. The lower body is torn open. The head lifts just enough to throw shadow into the mouth. Teeth catch the light. The flipper sits lower, quieter, less dramatic. Your eye goes to the mouth first. Of course it does. But the mouth is performing. The flipper is testifying. That split is where most sea monster stories live. A camera is not neutral. It compresses scale. It exaggerates contrast. It rewards the feature with the highest shock value. A 30-foot decomposing orca can look less like a whale than a much smaller animal would in life. In life, anatomy holds together. In death, it breaks into clues. This case may be one of the clearest examples. The internet locked onto the least reliable features: the jaws, the torn flesh, the theatrical outline. Expert focused on something almost boring by comparison. Flipper shape, fin structure, the ordinary architecture that decomposition had not fully erased. Orca sounds too normal for what people thought they saw. But they were not looking at an intact body. They were looking at weather, scavenging, and surf editing a body down to its most misleading parts. There is still a limit. No source here confirms a detailed physical examination. No archived tissue sample. No published DNA result. No chain of custody recovery that closed the case with laboratory neatness. The identification appears to rest on expert visual assessment from images and video. Strong visual assessment. Yes, still visual. The record never gets cleaner than the carcass itself. Officially, the Pukehina Beach Sea Monster was most likely a badly decomposed orca. On the sand, and on a screen seen 1.2 million times, it became something else. A known animal broken so completely that the fragments looked more persuasive than the whole. Number 8. Gambo carcass. In 2006, a team from the Center for Fortean Zoology went to the Gambia and tried to dig for remains that probably were not there anymore. The story arrives that late, not with a carcass on the sand, but with people years later searching a beach for something already carried off, buried, sold, or forgotten. No body, no skull, no tissue. Just the outline of an animal described by a witness who had been 15 years old when he saw it, and careful enough that people kept returning to his notes decades later. If what he described was real, the deep had not just returned a dead animal in pieces, it had returned a species few people on that beach would have recognized even intact. On the morning of June 12, 1983, at about 8:30, Owen Burnham walked down to the beach below the Bungalow Beach Hotel with his father, his brother, and his sister. Two local men were already there, working at a carcass that had washed in overnight. Burnham had grown up in West Africa and took wildlife seriously. He did not just recoil from the smell and move on, he measured it. Not with laboratory gear, with a line in the sand and a tape measure. He marked the length. He counted the teeth. He watched the proportions. He noticed the color, smooth brown and white. He noted 4 flippers. He looked for a blowhole and could not find an obvious one. He studied the jaws, long and narrow, and came away with a total length of roughly 15 to 16 feet, about 10 feet for the head and body. Another 4.5 to 5 feet for the tail. A snout around 1.5 feet. Flippers about 1.5 feet long. And in those jaws, by his count, around 80 teeth. That is what keeps the case alive. Numbers. Burnham had only said it looked like a sea monster. This would have died on the beach in 1983. He left a morphology, a body plan. Body plans can be tested, even years later, even secondhand. Cryptozoologist Carl Schuker paid attention when the case reached him through correspondence in 1986. By then, the carcass was gone. The head was gone. The thing people now call Gambo existed only as testimony, measurements, and drawings. Even the name came late. Schuker says Gambo was not coined on the beach, and not by him either. It seems to have first appeared in the title of a Fortean Times article in February/March 1993, apparently added in-house. The most famous part of the creature may be the label that arrived last. If Burnham's anatomy was basically right, the long jaws, the tooth count, the 4 flippers, the smooth body, and the missing obvious blowhole were not distortions from shock, heat, and decomposition. They were field marks. The picture stops being a random monster. It starts looking like a beaked whale. More specifically, people keep circling back to Shepard's beaked whale. That matters because this is not some giant cinematic beast hiding beyond the edge of marine biology. It is a real whale, rarely seen, and strange enough in profile that a decomposing specimen on a hotel beach could slip past ordinary categories. Long beak, slender jaws, many visible teeth compared with the beaked whale image most people carry, which is usually almost toothless. A body that does not present the clean, obvious look of the dolphins beachgoers thought they knew. If that is what washed ashore in the Gambia, then the ocean did not hide a monster. It handed people a genuine deep-water whale, and almost nobody on that beach had the tools to recognize it before the head was hacked off. And the head matters more than anything else. The men on the beach treated the carcass as a kind of dolphin and tried to remove the head, apparently to sell the skull to tourists. From one angle, that sounds absurd. From another, it makes the case feel real. Not a secret lab, not a government cover-up, just a valuable-looking skull on a beach near a hotel, in a place where tourists existed and curios had a price. Ordinary motives ruin evidence faster than conspiracies do. By the time anyone with specialist knowledge might have stepped in, the most diagnostic part of the animal was already the first target for removal. Now the whole case leans on Burnham's competence. That is where it gets uncomfortable. Skeptical zoologist Darren Naish did not just dismiss it as nonsense. He noted that Burnham was not the only witness. That alone separates this from pure invention. But Naish also pointed to the central weakness with brutal simplicity. No photo, no tissue sample, no recovered skull. There is also a technical problem inside that absence. Did Burnham make sketches directly at the carcass site while the animal was in front of him? Or were the surviving drawings reconstructed later from memory? The distinction sounds small until you realize the entire identification rests on shape. A long jaw drawn on the beach is observation. A long jaw drawn later is recollection. Those are not the same species of evidence. So two stories sit on top of each other. In one, a bright 15-year-old did exactly what you would want an accidental witness to do. Measured, counted, compared, and preserved enough detail that years later specialists could make a serious anatomical argument. In the other, every layer of that record softened before it reached us. No camera, no sample, no skull, uncertain sketch history. A body translated into notes, then notes into drawings, then drawings into debate. The beach gave up a carcass, but only after losing the parts that would have settled the matter cleanly. The details still refused to die. 15 to 16 feet is not fantasy scale. 80 teeth is not vague. 4 flippers is not poetic language. Those details either point to something real or collapse under scrutiny. That is why this case survives in the middle ground, where the best washed-ashore mysteries live. Too structured to dismiss in one sentence, too incomplete to close. Sometimes the damage is the whole story. Not claws, not tentacles. A known animal reduced to its least recognizable form, then reduced again by people standing right there with knives. By the time Gambo entered print, the creature itself had already vanished twice. First into decomposition, then into memory. What remains is a quiet image from that morning in 1983. A brown and white body on wet sand, 2 men working at the neck, and a boy counting teeth while the tide keeps coming in. Number 7. Naden Harbor Carcass. On July 4, 1937, at the Naden Harbor whaling station on Graham Island in Haida Gwaii, men cut open the forestomach of a bull sperm whale. It had been harpooned 8 to 10 hours earlier off Langara Island. They expected squid beaks, fish remains, the usual wreckage from a deep hunter's meal. Instead, they pulled out a long, narrow body about 3.5 meters long, maybe 3.8, depending on whose measurement you trust. Its neck looked too defined. Its head looked too strange. Men who worked around whales stopped what they were doing and stared. This was not a beach rumor. It came out of another animal. Naden Harbor was not some isolated fishing shack where one odd corpse could turn into a sea story by lunchtime. The station operated from roughly 1911 to 1943. These people handled whales for a living. They knew whale tissue. They knew fetal whales. They knew what decomposition could do. Witness Jim Wakelin later remembered people gathering around the thing because, to men used to seeing marine bodies ruined by digestion, it looked wrong. At the center of the case is not a retold legend but a thin, real paper trail. It begins with 3 black and white photographs. Station manager F.S. Huband made a choice that changed the tone of the whole story. He ordered the carcass staged, not tossed aside, not casually described. The body was placed on a table and packing boxes. A pale cloth was hung behind it. At least 3 photographs were taken from roughly 8 to 10 feet away by Huband and medical officer G.V. Borman. They treated the object like evidence before anyone knew what the evidence meant. Photographs are strange in the way strong evidence often is. They are not dramatic, they are not cinematic. They do not give one perfect angle that settles everything. They show a posed specimen with just enough clarity to start a fight that still has not ended. You can trace the long body, you can make out the small head, you can notice irregular bumps along the back that some later writers described as skute-like. You can see a tail that looks ragged rather than cleanly finned. Every feature comes through one brutal filter. This thing had been inside a sperm whale. That pushes the argument back to the stomach itself. Supporters of the mystery emphasize that the carcass came from the whale's first stomach, where digestion would have been limited compared with what came later in the tract. That is the technical foothold for the extraordinary reading. If the body had not yet been reduced to mush, the strange proportions might matter. The long neck might be real. The body plan might be real. Maybe this was not just meat torn into a misleading shape by acid, pressure, and time. The record continues beyond the whaling station. The carcass was salted, shipped south, and displayed publicly in Bellevue, Washington, at the headquarters of the American Pacific Whaling Company from July 8th to July 22nd, 1937, in a tub of acetone. This was not a dockside curiosity that vanished in an hour. For 2 weeks there was a body, preserved, exhibited, looked at. A fragment from the deep sat in public view. You would expect the case to get stronger from there. More viewers, more notes, better descriptions, maybe a specimen number, maybe a museum entry. Maybe one clean anatomical report that turns a marine monster into a solved zoological problem. Instead, the chain of custody starts to dissolve. After Bellevue, the carcass went back to Victoria. There, museum director Francis Kermode examined it and judged it a fetal baleen whale. That sounds definitive. It sounds like the end. But the story does not act finished. If Kermode had enough specimen in front of him to make that call, where is the preserved body? Where is the accession record? Where is the anatomical write-up clear enough to kill the mystery before it was born? That contradiction keeps Naden Harbor alive. Experts apparently did see the carcass. So the case splits in two. On one side are believers who look at the photographs and the origin story, removed from a sperm whale's forestomach, staged by a station manager, photographed by named men, displayed in acetone, examined by a museum director, and say this is too specific to dismiss as folklore. In 1995, Edward Bousfield and Paul LeBlanc pushed that argument all the way to a name, Cadborosaurus wilsey. They used the old photos in Amphipacifica as the backbone of a formal description. Not a campfire monster, a species. On the other side is the problem that made even editors object. 2 of them pushed back on treating photographs as enough to describe a new species. That is not academic fussiness, it is the whole case. Once the specimen disappears, shape takes over. Everything depends on outline, proportion, and how much violence digestion had already done. So skeptics start with known animals deformed by bad conditions. Kermode's answer was fetal baleen whale. That remains the classic deflation. The whaling station finds a bizarre body inside a larger whale. Experienced men misread an immature whale under grotesque conditions. The mystery grows later because the body is gone and the photos are ambiguous. Clean, plausible, hard to kill, but it is not the only skeptical answer. Darren Naish has argued that if you are trying to explain the long body, the bumps along the back, and the ragged tail, a decomposed sturgeon may fit better than either sea serpent fantasy or an instantly recognized baby whale, which gives the whole story a grim edge. One of the Pacific Northwest's most persistent marine enigmas may have been a fish dragged through a whale's digestive system and then laid on a tabletop under a white sheet. Still, the photos resist easy closure. You look at them, and the body seems too composed for sludge, too elongated for a simple lump. The staging itself matters too. Men who processed whales every day did not wave this away at the scene. But that feeling is exactly where washed-ashore mysteries become dangerous. Confidence slips in through the missing material. The less body you have, the more power the image gains. The deep keeps doing this. It does not return a whole answer. It returns a damaged specimen, a narrow viewing angle, a report with names on it. Then the one thing that could settle the story is gone. In this case, the evidence lasted 18 days in public and 88 years in argument. The photograph survived. The carcass did not. Number 6. Moore's Beach Monster. Late May, or maybe the first days of June, 1925. You're on a strip of sand just northwest of Santa Cruz, at Moore's Beach, near the mouth of Moore Creek. Today people call it Natural Bridges State Beach. Back then it was just a shoreline with a bad smell rolling off the surf, and a crowd forming for the oldest reason in the world. Something impossible is lying in public view. Charles Moore is usually named as the man who found it. Local accounts place the carcass near the creek, on a beach named for Eli Moore's old ranch. What he came across was the sort of thing that turns rumor into an event before lunch. A huge head, small eyes, a beak like a duck's, a neck that looked absurdly long, rotten flesh, a stink strong enough to do half the storytelling by itself. Then the crowd starts talking, and the details begin to breed. You're there too. You do not get a clean specimen on a steel table. You get a collapsing body in salt air. The outline looks wrong. The proportions look wrong. Parts that should register as whale do not register as whale at all. Popular accounts pushed the length anywhere from around 30 feet to more than 50. That is a massive spread. It tells you exactly what kind of scene this was. Nobody is carefully measuring a legend while it rots in front of them. They look once, recoil, and keep the version that frightens them most. On that beach, anatomy turns into mythology. The head becomes reptilian. The beak becomes proof. The body and tail, twisted together into a roughly 6-meter tubular line, get read as a single long neck. Suddenly, this is no longer an animal from the California coast. It is a survivor, a holdout, thing that should have died with the age of reptiles and instead washed into the 20th century on a public beach. It sounds ridiculous now. In 1925, it had enough force to stick. One name keeps surfacing in retellings: E.L. Wallace. He is often presented as the man who pushed the prehistoric angle, arguing that the body might be some ancient creature preserved in ice. Read that slowly. Preserved in ice. Washed ashore in California. In summer. The claim should have collapsed on contact. It did not spread because it was sturdy. It spread because it was vivid. Wallace himself is still hazy enough that modern summaries cannot even pin down who he was or how much authority he really had. That matters. Give a mystery even a blurry credential, and people start treating it like evidence. The whole episode cuts straight to the problem underneath every carcass in this video. What is the deep hiding, and why does it return the evidence in pieces? A broken body gives imagination a head start. If you'd walked up cold, the long shape would have hit you first. The useful clue was probably in the head. Small eyes, a bulbous forehead, a long beak. Not a dragon, not a plesiosaur, a beaked whale. That matters because Baird's beaked whale is not some tiny, obscure animal that nobody could mistake for anything else. It is the largest of the beaked whales. NOAA gives adults up to 36 feet for females and 35 for males, with weights over 26,000 pounds. Part of the legend begins there, with something ordinary and still enormous. This was already a large, strange, deep-water cetacean before decay got involved. Baird's beaked whales fit the coast too. They occur off the U.S. coast from California to Alaska. They prefer deep oceanic water, but they can show up near shore where the continental shelf is narrow. The ocean did not need to invent a monster for Moore's Beach. It already had something alien-looking on the books. The public almost never gets the living animal. It gets the ruined version. Skin slips, fat collapses, familiar contours vanish. A tail folds into a body and starts reading as a neck. Distances stretch in memory. One photograph emphasizes one line. One witness emphasizes another. The carcass is grotesque enough to feel important, so the story does not settle at dead whale. It escalates. The first visual story hits harder than the later correction. A beach crowd sees a monster in 10 seconds. A museum spends days undoing it. The crowd's version keeps moving. The specimen was eventually sent to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. There, the drama shrank back into anatomy. People who knew cetacean skulls and soft tissue got hold of it, and the Moore's Beach Monster stopped being a prehistoric refugee. It became Berardius bairdii, a decomposed Baird's beaked whale. 4 years later, on November 11, 1929, M. E. McClellan Davidson published the formal note in the Journal of Mammalogy. 3 pages. Pages 356 to 358. Brief, dry, fatal to the legend. The legend lasted longer than the paper. That part deserves a closer look. The experts did not fail here. The correction exists. It was written down. It named the animal. It explained the body. The monster survived anyway because the beach version was better television before television. Huge head, tiny eyes, duckbill, long neck, elephant-like legs with toenails in some retellings, because by then, the carcass had started collecting extra parts. Once people remember a thing as a beast, they do not remember less of it over time. They remember more. You can watch the mechanism work. A real carcass appears. Decay erases the features that would identify it quickly. The crowd fills the gaps with the oldest shapes it knows. Newspapers amplify the wildest reading. Later retellings smooth out the uncertainty and make the monster cleaner than the evidence ever was. Then the technical identification arrives, correct and boring, and loses the popularity contest. So no, Moore's Beach did not give California a plesiosaur. It gave us something more useful. A clean demonstration of how a known animal can cross a beach in pieces and come back as folklore. The ocean did not hand over a whole answer. It handed over a damaged, beaked whale with just enough of its head intact to solve the case, and just enough of the rest destroyed to keep the myth alive. And the man who tried to make it ancient may be less solid than the carcass itself ever was. It might have been preserved in ice. Number 5. Bermuda Blob. In May 1988, Teddy Tucker stands in Mangrove Bay, Somerset, Bermuda, with a legal pad gone soft at the edges from sea air and a government permit folded in his pocket. He is not out looking for monsters. He is a diver, a wreck man, a treasure hunter. He spends his life around objects with names, dates, owners, chain of title, things you can identify, things you can sign for. The morning is bright. The water inside the bay looks almost tame. Then he sees the thing on the shore. It is white. Not the pink white of fresh meat, not the gray of a stranded dolphin. White like soaked rope. White like sailcloth left in salt too long. It lies at the edge of the bay in a low, heavy sheet, roughly 2.50 meters long, 1.25 meters across, maybe 0.30 meters thick where it bunches on itself. No head, no eyes, no ribs lifting the skin, no spine, no organs spilling out, just a mass. He walks closer because that is what he does. He has seen fish rot. He has seen turtles break apart. He has seen enough dead things from the sea to know the usual signs. This one gives him none of them. The surface is slick in places and fibrous in others. When he presses at it, it does not collapse like blubber. It does not pull apart like ordinary flesh. It resists. Dense. Wet. Wool-like. He will later describe it that way because there is no cleaner word. A few people gather. Beaches always do that. One person hangs back. Another steps in too close. Tucker kneels and works a hand under one edge, trying to find structure, some clue that says this was once an animal with a front and a back. The tissue lifts in heavy folds. Inside, the cut face shows a pattern like a honeycomb, pale chambers packed tight together. It looks manufactured. It looks wrong. It smells real enough. He does what a practical man does when the ocean hands him something impractical. He takes samples. He notes the place. He has the mass hauled and preserved. The document in his pocket matters now because this has stopped being beach gossip. He bags a specimen. He tags it. He moves it under permission instead of curiosity. It is no longer just a thing people saw. It is evidence. Evidence like this can mislead. This one arrives with every label stripped off. Word moves through Bermuda fast. By the time the photographs circulate, the carcass has a name, the Bermuda Blob. Not a whale, not a fish, not anything with recognizable anatomy, just a blob. The word lowers the standard of proof and gives the imagination room to run. Tucker's white mass starts echoing an older corpse from another shore, the famous St. Augustine mass from 1896, with that same pale, fibrous, nearly featureless look that once let a decomposing body masquerade as a giant octopus. The resemblance is enough. After that comparison gets into the air, the thing on the beach is no longer only a specimen. It is a possible survivor from the age of sea monsters. Years pass in jars and freezers. In April 1995, in volume 188, number 2 of the Biological Bulletin, pages 219 through 230, the specimen comes back out under laboratory lights. Sidney K. Pierce is there. Eugenie Clark is involved. Gerald Smith. Timothy Moggle. The room is plain. No storm outside. No crowd at the windows. Preserved tissue, blades, microscopes, notes, and the slow discipline of forcing a shapeless thing to give up a species. At the bench, the sample is trimmed. Under the electron microscope, the fantasy starts dying first. Cephalopod muscle should look like muscle, ordered fibers. Tissue architecture that says squid, octopus, something built for tentacles and movement. This does not. What they see is collagen. Layered, structural, stubborn collagen. Connective tissue. The giant octopus idea takes the blow right there. The Bermuda Blob is not a giant cephalopod stranded whole. The body still refuses to yield completely. Collagen answers one question and opens another. They run amino acid analysis. Numbers now, but numbers with teeth. The total amino acid content comes in at 167 residues per 1,000. That profile leans away from a warm-blooded mammal and toward a cold-blooded vertebrate. A large fish, a shark, a ray. The texture on the beach now has a laboratory shadow behind it. Tough white matrix, no obvious organs, no bones in the sample. Collagen, consistent with something big, marine, and not octopus at all. The legend narrows. It does not disappear, it changes shape. Outside the lab, that nuance is hard to keep intact. Scientists think sea monster tale works as a headline, but only halfway. If the public monster was a giant octopus, then yes, that version is dead. In the actual room, with the actual tissue, nobody is pointing to one clean carcass and closing the file. They have ruled something out. They have leaned toward something else. The beach body is still withholding its name. Then Bermuda sends another piece. In January 1997, a second blob beaches on Bermuda. Another pale mass. Another sample. Wolfgang Sterer of the Bermuda Biological Laboratory supplies tissue from this new arrival, and the case doubles back on itself. The first find in Mangrove Bay was strange enough as a one-off. Two of them means the first can no longer be treated as an isolated oddity or a local prank of decay. Somewhere out in the water, whatever process makes these bodies into white, anonymous slabs is happening more than once. The scene widens without changing location. The beach in Bermuda is still the beach in Bermuda, but other coastlines start crowding into it. Tasmania, Nantucket, Chile, St. Augustine. By 2004, 6 blob cases are set beside one another, each one found as a nearly featureless marine remainder, each one forcing the same first reaction. This does not look like any normal dead animal. Some of the later work gets molecular help the Bermuda sample never cleanly provided. In the Chilean case, an 800 base pair mitochondrial fragment amplifies and points straight at sperm whale DNA. That does not instantly rewrite what Tucker saw in 1988, but it changes the room he is standing in. The Bermuda Blob is no longer alone with its mystery. It is part of a pattern. Back in Mangrove Bay, return to that first morning and look again. White, yes. Fibrous, yes. Honeycomb inside. No head, no bones, no organs. All true. But the date itself starts to blur in the paperwork. Local reporting ties the first blob to May 1988. The 1995 paper does too. Yet a later methods section mentions Bermuda Blob 1, as if it washed ashore in 1995. Labeling error, separate confusion, crossed records. The documents do not settle it cleanly. The paper trail around the thing has started to fray. Tucker is still on the beach in the version that matters most. He is crouched over that white mass with the permit in his pocket and seawater at his boots, trying to lift a corner of something that will not present a face. He has found a body with no body plan. The crowd behind him wants a creature. The lab years ahead will give it collagen, then fish, then something larger and stranger in its own way. Right now his fingers are in the fibers. The inner chambers open like wet comb. The thing on the sand still refuses to tell him which giant it fell off of. Number 4. Chilean Blob. In late June or early July 2003, Elsa Cabrera stood on a remote beach near Los Muermos in southern Chile and looked at something that should have been easy to name. Cabrera was a whale conservationist. She knew what a dead whale looked like. People on those coasts saw plenty of them. This did not arrive looking like a whale. It lay there as a gray-brown slab of rotting tissue about 12 meters long, around 41 feet by 19 feet, weighing an estimated 13 tons. It was folded into itself like wet leather left in the tide too long. No head, no flippers, no bones pushing through, no organs spilling out. Just a huge gelatinous sheet, the size of a small bus, breathing out the sweet, heavy smell of decomposition into the winter air. Her first thought was whale. Then she got closer. The sea likes to return evidence only after it has stripped away the features people use first. Shape, symmetry, eyes, limbs, a mouth. Cabrera later said the texture and smell seemed wrong. Not just bad, wrong. The carcass looked less like an animal than what an animal leaves behind after the ocean has edited it down to one impossible material. Local people came to stare. Authorities prodded the folds. Children posed beside it for photographs. By the time the pictures moved beyond southern Chile, the object had already left the beach in another way. It had entered headlines. There, it became a sea monster, an octopus, a giant squid, a creature from deeper water than anyone could name with confidence. Cabrera had the one disadvantage that mattered most. She was close enough to smell it. From far away, a blob turns into mythology. Up close, it turns into forensic work. The world rushed to imagine tentacles that were not there. Chilean researchers did the less glamorous job. On July 8, 2003, Sergio Letelier of Chile's National Museum of Natural History traveled roughly 1,000 kilometers south of Santiago to examine the mass for himself. A museum scientist stood on a remote Pacific beach with a knife in his hand, cutting samples from a carcass the press had already promoted into legend. He did not have a complete skeleton to measure. He did not have a skull to compare. He had strips of flesh from something that had lost almost every recognizable landmark. Even in that condition, some clues were loud. Letelier said it was not an octopus. On that point, he was confident. The tissue did not support the fantasy people wanted, but he stopped short of naming it. That hesitation mattered. In cases like this, the first honest answer is often smaller than the public will accept. Not, "Here is the monster." Not even, "Here is the species." Just this: whatever you think you are looking at, you are probably looking at it wrong. The beach kept producing confusion. Reporters leaned into the mystery because mystery photographs better than decomposition. The carcass had folds that suggested limbs if you wanted to see limbs. It had scale. It had no obvious anatomy. It had the single most useful feature for any fake sea beast. It refused to behave like a textbook body. Letelier and his colleague Jose Yanez were looking for something duller and far more decisive. Tissue architecture, surface structures, microscopic traits. The details that survive after the silhouette is gone. July 11th, only 3 days after Letelier's public caution, Chilean scientists announced that they had identified sperm whale dermal glands in the sample. That sentence is very different from sea monster found. It is smaller, drier, almost disappointingly technical. But it changed the entire beach. Once sperm whale skin structures entered the picture, the impossible mass started to become a very specific kind of remains. Not a complete carcass, not a fresh stranding. Something stranger than that. When a sperm whale decomposes in the ocean, the usual body plan can come apart in stages. Bones can sink, internal structures can collapse, skin and blubber can separate and float free. The huge spermaceti region in the head can preserve a deceptive bulk long after the animal has stopped looking like an animal. That is how these strandings produce their nightmare geometry. A body with no face. A giant with no skeleton. A creature that is really the outer architecture of a whale after the sea has removed the parts people expect to see first. The carcass on Cabrera's beach had not broken the rules of biology. It had broken the rules of recognition. That should have settled it. It did not. Official identification and public belief rarely arrive together. One lives in notes and tissue samples. The other lives in images. Images are stubborn. A 12-meter sheet of gray-brown flesh on an empty Chilean shore does not feel like a whale to the average eye. Because whales in the imagination keep their outlines. They stay intact. They remain legible. This thing was not legible. It looked manufactured by rot itself. So the story kept breathing for months. The official answer sounded too ordinary for the evidence people thought they could see. The final blow to the monster story came later, under magnification. In 2004, Sidney "Skip" Pierce and his team took the Chilean material into the lab and treated it not as folklore, but as a repeat offender: microscopy, biochemistry, DNA. They were asking what had washed ashore in Chile. They were also asking whether Chile belonged to a longer chain of carcasses that had baffled people in Bermuda, Tasmania, Nantucket, and Florida. Under the microscope, the tissue showed the same collagen pattern seen in whale blubber from earlier so-called sea monsters. Then came the molecular result: an 800 base pair mitochondrial DNA fragment amplified by PCR and a sequence that matched sperm whale 100%. Not close, not suggestive, identical. Go back to Elsa Cabrera on that first day. She was right to hesitate. It did not look right. It did not smell right. It did not behave like the clean idea of a whale carcass most people carry around in their heads. That was the point. The beach had not received a beast. It had received the last floating layer of one. Officially, the Chilean blob became a sperm whale on July 11th. In the lab, the sequence ended the argument. 100% sperm whale. Number 3. Tecoluta Sea Monster. On March 6, 1969, a wire story moved across newspapers with exactly the kind of line editors love and biologists hate. A monstrous creature had washed ashore on the Gulf Coast of Veracruz. The place was Palmar de Susana, between Tecoluta and Nautla. The size changed depending on who was talking. 30 feet long and 18 feet wide in one version, 35 tons in another. But the picture stayed the same. A gigantic head, a long, pointed beak, bones jutting out like tusks or horns, hair or wool hanging from the body, skin that looked armored. For a few days, Mexico did not have a carcass. It had a prehistoric survivor. The story hardened because the first people on the beach did not treat it like drift meat. They treated it like something that might still be alive, or had only just died. Word reached Tecolutla's mayor, Professor Cesar Guerrero. He gathered men and went out to the site. One account says they expected they might even be dealing with a crashed aircraft. What they found instead was a huge, rotting mass jammed on the shore, already changing shape in the heat, already being cut apart by villagers taking pieces. By the time biologists from the Fishing and Biology Station in Tampico examined it, the clean outline of the animal was gone. With the outline gone, imagination filled the gaps. This case works because distortion came first, not hoax. A large whale dies offshore. The skin slips, the blubber swells, the skull loosens, fibers separate. People see it at different hours, from different angles, in different stages of collapse. Newspapers compress those shifting views into one fixed monster. To see that happen, strip the myth down to the hardware. Start with the beak. In a living rorqual whale, the group that includes sei whales, fin whales, blue whales, the front of the skull is long, narrow, and tapered. Clean, symmetrical. Decomposition does not preserve that geometry. Soft tissue peels away. Baleen rots. The rostrum can emerge as a hard, pointed structure with no obvious context around it. On a Veracruz beach in 1969, with no intact flippers, no tail neatly displayed, and half the face gone, that shape does not read as whale. It reads as a beak. Now the horns. Here the whole monster starts to fall apart. Later reconstructions of the surviving photos pointed to something much less dramatic than exotic anatomy: the lower jaw bones. In a badly decayed rorqual skull, the mandibles can splay outward from the head. From the wrong angle, they stop looking like jaw bones and start looking like tusks, or horns. Or some impossible paired weapon on a creature nobody has cataloged. The monster did not need to grow horns. Its jaws only had to come apart. Then, the wool. Newspaper accounts loved that detail because hair belongs to land mammals and mythic beasts, not streamlined marine animals. Rotting whales produce fibrous textures all the time. Connective tissue frays. Baleen breaks down into stringy masses. Blubber and muscle detach in ragged strips. In salt, heat, insects, and rough handling, those strips can look uncannily like coarse hair. Not fur, not a mane. Tissue forgetting what it used to be. The armor-like skin fits the same pattern. Whale skin does not decay evenly. It peels in sheets. It buckles. Outer layers dry and crack. It starts to look tougher than it is. Add sand, salt, and cuts from people taking samples, and a smooth animal turns patchy and plated. Not scales. Weather and time. The numbers help, but only if you handle them carefully. One later reconstruction gave the carcass a length of 22 meters, a width of 2 meters, and a mass around 24 tons. The wire version said 30 feet by 18 feet and called it a 35-ton creature. Another account pushed the first sighting back to February 17th and described the head alone as 6 feet across, 4 feet high, weighing roughly 1 ton. Those measurements do not line up cleanly. They clash. That clash is a clue. Nobody was measuring a stable object. They were measuring panic, rumor, distance, and a body that was physically collapsing while the story spread. What animal can survive that distortion and still fit the surviving anatomy? A rorqual can. Probably a sei whale, Balænoptera borealis. An adult sei whale reaches sexual maturity at around 45 feet. That matters because once a large rorqual loses the familiar silhouette people expect, dorsal line, flukes, flippers, smooth skull, intact skin, it becomes almost unrecognizable, especially after villagers have already cut pieces away before trained observers arrive. The Tampico biologists could not identify it on the spot, but that failure is less mysterious than it sounds. Identification gets harder once a carcass has been butchered, scavenged, and photographed out of context. And context was the first thing this case lost. Some reports said the thing appeared on February 17th. Others said February 28th. The major wire story ran March 6th. Rumor streams fused together until the same carcass was described as a whale, a relic from the age of dinosaurs, an animal preserved in an iceberg, and even a kind of roadside curiosity with disputed remains in a museum orbit. One witness sees the head, another hears the weight, another repeats the hair, another prints the beak. By the end, nobody is describing one carcass anymore. They are describing a creature assembled from fragments. Later investigators mattered. Ivan Sanderson and John Keel, who had every reason to be interested in strange beasts, both leaned toward a whale explanation warped by decay and retelling. Later still, researcher Rafael Lara Palmeiros traced surviving photographs to biologists at the National University. Their identification was blunt: rorqual skull, probably a sei whale. No hidden species, no armored survivor from prehistory. No living fossil dragging itself onto a Vera Cruz beach. A baleen whale, dismantled by decomposition until even its jaws looked invented. One thing still refuses to settle. We do not have a single original record that locks down the basic timeline. February 17th or February 28th. 30 feet or 22 meters. 35 tons or 24. The anatomy points one way with surprising confidence. The paper trail does not. The bones say whale. The record stays blurred, already coming apart at the waterline before anyone could write it down. Number 2. Stronsay Beast. In 1809, the name was already in print. Halcydrus pontopidani. A sea serpent, dressed in Latin and entered into natural history because a carcass on an Orkney shore had been measured at 55 feet, described with 6 appendages, and backed by sworn testimony taken on November 19, 1808. 4 vertebrae were preserved. Drawings circulated. Edinburgh took it seriously. Follow the numbers far enough, and this stops looking like one clean discovery. It becomes the same problem running through this whole video. The deep keeps giving back evidence in pieces. Start with the first sighting. September 26, 1808. John Peace, a tenant farmer and fisherman, was off the east part of Rothiesholm Head on Stronsay. About a quarter of a mile from the headland, seabirds were screaming over submerged rocks. He turned his boat toward them because, from a distance, the thing looked like a dead whale. That first number matters, a quarter mile. He was not standing over it. He was not hauling it onto shore. He was looking at something low in the water, at range, broken up by birds and swell. Peace came closer. The shape still did not fit a whale. The middle rose above the water. One appendage, hooked and lifted with a boat pole, looked less like a fin than an arm or a wing. That word matters because it begins the counting problem. Witnesses did not just say fins. They kept coming back to 6 separate projections: arms, wings, paws, depending on the account. 6 is too many for an ordinary whale. It is also too many for an ordinary shark if the animal is intact. About 10 days later, the carcass washed ashore. By then, the weather had started taking it apart. Flesh loosened. Surfaces changed. The measurements began after the body had already crossed from organism to remains. That is where the big number entered the story. 54 to 55 feet. One report gives roughly that range. Another gives exactly 55. A neat number. A dramatic number. Large enough to push the case away from shark and toward monster. Now strip the description down like an investigator. Length, 54 to 55 feet. Appendages, 6. Head, small. Neck, long. Skin, gray. Along the back or neck, some witnesses described bristles, even a mane. From the stomach, red fluid. Put together fast, it sounds impossible. Small head, long neck, mane, 6 arms, 55 feet. You can see why naturalists in Edinburgh did not laugh. Patrick Neal did more than note it. He named it. Halcydrus pontoppidan in 1809. That matters because a Latin name changes the argument. It is no longer just beach talk. It becomes a specimen with status. Rural eyewitnesses had sworn statements. Local men had taken measurements. Pieces of the body existed. The Veterinarian Society in Edinburgh received remains, including 4 vertebrae. The case now had paperwork, fragments, and authority. London had its own authority. Sir Everard Home looked at the same controversy and cut the length from 55 feet to about 30. Not a sea serpent, a decomposed basking shark. Ceterinus maximus. This was not a minor correction. Roughly 25 feet disappeared by anatomical interpretation alone. The fight was never just monster versus shark. It was measurement versus reconstruction. Witnesses versus comparative anatomy. Shoreline scale versus what decomposition can do to a fish built from cartilage and soft tissue. Basking sharks become extremely misleading after death. The jaws and gill structures fall apart first. The head shrinks into something oddly small. Tissue behind the skull can trail out and resemble a neck. Lower structures can peel back into limb-like strips. A half-rotted shark can stop looking like a shark with insulting speed. That explanation has solved more than one sea serpent in the record. The Stronsay case still does not sit quietly because the witnesses were not all describing one quick glimpse in bad light. Depositions were taken on November 19, 1808, before justices of the peace. Names were attached: John Peace, George Sherrar, others. The process was formal enough that later writers kept returning to it as one of the stronger serpent cases. Not because the anatomy was unbeatable, but because the testimony was sworn and the numbers sounded solid. Then the drawings make the case even messier. The famous image most people know was not a pristine sketch of an intact beast. Later analysis showed that the surviving images depended heavily on drawings by a Mr. Petrie, made after the carcass was already disintegrating. Under oath, some witnesses criticized details in that drawing. So even the picture fixed in public memory may be part observation, part reconstruction, part drift. The body was coming apart while the image was being assembled. Go back to the key measurements: 55 feet on shore, about 30 feet by Holmes' reconstruction, 4 vertebrae preserved, which is not much if you are trying to rebuild an entire animal. 6 appendages reported, though decomposing shark tissue can create exactly the kind of false counting that panics a witness. A quarter-mile first approach, which means the earliest visual impression came through distance and movement. Every number helps. Every number also opens a second reading. Why did the 55-foot figure survive? It was repeated early, repeated formally, and repeated in a culture already primed for sea serpent reports. Tell people the body has a long neck and measures 55 feet, and every loose fold of tissue starts acting like evidence. A torn fin becomes a limb. A collapsed head becomes a skull unlike any fish. Red fluid from the abdomen turns theatrical. The carcass stops being read from anatomy outward. It gets read from expectation inward. Holmes' answer did not close the file either. A basking shark explains the neck. It explains the small head. It explains how a gigantic fish could lose the structures that make it recognizable. It even explains why a taxonomic name later ended up treated as invalid and folded into Ceterinus maximus. But it does not fully explain the confidence behind those local measurements, or why multiple observers clustered around the same inflated scale. Mismeasurement is easy to declare from a desk in London. Harder on a beach, with men pacing out a body in front of them. Years later, the Stronsay Beast survives for a reason more interesting than the word monster. The evidence is thin in exactly the wrong places. No complete skeleton, no intact head, no uncontested drawing. 4 vertebrae, a disputed image, a named species erased into synonymy, and 1 number lodged like a splinter in the whole case. 5 feet. Holmes said 30. Number 1. St. Augustine Monster. On December 5, 1896, a pale mass lay on the sand 12 miles south of St. Augustine, Florida. It was so large that men argued over tonnage before they agreed on what it was. 7 tons, said one estimate. 5 or 6, said another. 21 feet long after sand was cleared away, maybe only 18 by 10 in a different description. Either way, this was not driftwood, not a stranded fish, not anything a passerby could step over and forget. It rose about 4.5 feet off the beach like a collapsed wall of flesh. If the first dramatic reading had been true, if those blunt projections really were the remains of arms, then the Atlantic had thrown up evidence of a giant octopus on the coast of Florida. Not a sailor's tale, not a sketch from a tavern wall, a body. This is the last and cleanest version of the pattern running through every carcass in this video. The deep keeps giving up evidence in pieces. At St. Augustine, for a moment, the answer looked brutally simple. An animal so large that modern zoology had somehow missed it. Late in 1896, on Anastasia Island south of St. Augustine, 2 boys found the thing first and reported it as a whale. That was the ordinary answer. Sensible, practical. But the report reached Dr. DeWitt Webb, founder of the St. Augustine Historical Society and Institute of Science, and he did what turned a local site into a century-long case file. He went to the beach. He photographed it. He tried to have it hauled above the tide line. He measured what he could. Then he started writing letters. You can watch the case grow in real time. The body is huge. The tissue is pale and thick. The shape is wrong. Seem to be stumps, arms, tentacles, something projecting from the mass. The boy's first guess starts to lose ground to a better story. Webb sends descriptions, photographs, and tissue to scientific contacts. The beach turns into a laboratory. The local oddity becomes evidence. The flesh does not look like ordinary whale meat, so the possibility opens that this is not a whale at all, but a cephalopod on a scale almost no one living had imagined. In early 1897, Yale zoologist Addison Emery Verrill stepped into that opening and pushed it wider. He did not just call the carcass unusual. He chose the most dramatic interpretation available: a gigantic octopus. He even proposed a name: Octopus giganteus. After that, the object changed status. It was no longer just the St. Augustine carcass. It was a candidate species, something the Atlantic had concealed and the beach had exposed. Picture the scene: a Florida beach in winter. In front of you sits a mound of flesh the size of a small room. The tissue is ropey, elastic, strangely clean in some places, and frayed in others. The sea has erased the head. It has erased the eyes. It has erased almost every feature that would let you read the body quickly. What remains is just enough to tempt you. A fold looks like a limb. A torn edge looks deliberate. Collagen fibers flare outward and start performing as tentacles. When the deep returns evidence in broken pieces, this is how it tricks the eye. Decomposition does the imaginative work. The numbers made that illusion stronger. Webb's letters described tissue thickness at 13.5 inches on January 14, 1897. By February 12, he gave 10.5 inches. Mass was still on the beach on March 17, nearly 4 months after the initial discovery. This was not some delicate jelly dissolving in a day. It endured. It sat there through winter weather like heavy industrial material, tough enough to cut, preserve, mail, compare. That kind of durability feels wrong for an octopus, if you know octopus flesh. It also feels wrong for the public idea of whale blubber. People imagine greasy softness, not something springy and stubborn enough to mimic anatomy. So the case climbed. Newspapers carried the exciting version. Scientific language gave it authority. Then the facts started arriving more slowly than the headline had. Verrill examined the samples. That is where the turn begins. The tissue did not behave like muscle. It was not the dense, contractile flesh you would expect from a massive cephalopod arm. It was tough, elastic, fibrous, more like connective material, closer to whale blubber than to octopus tissue. The tentacle stumps began to collapse under inspection. What looked like limbs on the beach could be folds, tears, and frayed collagen. The details that created the monster were the same details decomposition had invented. The correction never traveled as far as the revelation. Verrill's giant octopus claim spread fast because it was vivid. His pullback spread slowly because corrections almost always do. So the public monster survived the death of the scientific monster. The lag between announcement and support kept the carcass alive far longer than the beach ever could. The preserved sample went to the Smithsonian and entered the collections under accession number 31678 as sections of the muscle envelope of the body of Octopus giganteus. Even the label carried the wrong answer forward. Once a specimen is archived under a monstrous identity, it gets a second life. Decades pass. New books cite old labels. Old uncertainty hardens into folklore. What began as a beach problem becomes inheritance. Nearly a century later, in 1995, the case returned under much colder light. Researchers used electron microscopy and biochemical analysis on the preserved St. Augustine material. This time, the tissue was judged not by silhouette or beachside intuition, but by microscopic structure and chemistry. The result was plain. The sample showed collagen from a warm-blooded vertebrate. Its amino acid total was 223 residues per 1,000, a figure consistent with vertebrate collagen and not with octopus tissue. In other words, the sea monster had the biochemical signature of blubber. Not a neat, triumphant blubber either. The exact source animal was not pinned down as cleanly as later DNA-confirmed blobs would be. So a sliver of looseness remained. November discovery or a December 5th stranding. 18 feet or 21. 5 tons or 7. Whale, yes, almost certainly whale, but which whale is harder? The file never becomes perfectly tidy. But the central transformation is complete. The giant octopus dissolves. The beach fantasy gives way to connective tissue. That is why this case belongs at the peak. St. Augustine is not just another mistaken monster. Here, the whole mechanism shows itself. 2 boys looked at a carcass and said whale. Experts arrived, saw shape where shape no longer existed, and upgraded it into legend. Science corrected itself, but the correction moved too slowly to catch the myth. Then a museum drawer kept that myth on life support for almost 100 years until microscopy dragged it back into the category it never should have left. The deep did return evidence here. It came back in the worst possible form, huge, incomplete, and just plausible enough to trigger the wrong expertise. The oldest answer was the best one. The boys were closest. By the time the case finally settled, the monster had already outlived the animal. As one early witness put it, it was supposed to be a whale.